Okay, well, this presentation, good morning, everybody. This presentation is focusing on a quick review of the 13 colonies, the original 13 colonies of the United States. So, what we've been talking about this week has been basically the beginnings of what would have become the United States. So, it's always important to know the origins of where we come from, where people come from. So, just to kind of recap a few things, remember, colony. What is a colony? It's a settlement in a new area. The first colonies in North America were along the eastern coast, just because the geography coming from Europe. And the people who arrived here were known as a settler. What is a settler? It's a person that moves into area, usually to colonize. And in the early parts, in the 16 and the 1700s, most of the settlers came from Spain, France, Sweden, Holland, and England. The original, first arrived the Spaniards into what is today Mexico and the Caribbean in the 1500s. And eventually the French arrived, and then the English arrived around the year 1600. After 1600, I'm pardon. So all these settlers are coming from Europe, and despite the differences they have in their language and their religion, they're arriving here with the same reasons to come here, and that's to find a better opportunity, you know, find riches, whether it's gold or something that they can bring back or resources. So in this case, when we look back at the 13 colonies, the original 13 colonies, we're looking at today what is today Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and what is today the state of Maine and New Hampshire. So these were the first colonies, and they arrived here in the 1600s. Originally, the first permanent English settlement arrives what is today here in Virginia, in Jamestown, underneath right here where my purse is at by Chesapeake Bay, and eventually the Puritans, or as we know as little kids, the Pilgrims, arrived here at Cape Cod and what is today in Massachusetts, what is today Plymouth Rock in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And as I mentioned before, the reason why people come here is because some people didn't like or agree with the Church of England. Just to give you some background, in England there was only one religion, and that was a Christian religion that was known as the Anglicans or the Church of England. And the Church of England was run by the King of England, and it was created, because the King of England wanted to be able to, divorce his wife back in the early 1600s, and at the end, he wasn't allowed to, but he decided by the Pope at that time, which was kept, and he decided to create his own church. But to kind of relate it back to here, the church wanted to be more, the reason why the Puritans came here, the Pilgrims, was because they didn't agree with everything that the Church of England did. And they had their own version of what should be Christianity. And in this case, they wanted the church to be more pure, and they became known as the Puritans. So they set off and sailed out to the northeast part of the United States in Massachusetts, and landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. What is today Plymouth, Massachusetts? And they established their colony in New England. These were people who were very strict and religious. There was, if you lived in those times in Salem or in Plymouth, a lot of these Puritans were very religious. There was no private and public life. It was mixed in. So they knew all your business. They knew everything that was going on, and they lived that strict lifestyle during this period. So that's one of the main reasons why they came. One of the reasons was religion. A lot of these groups would end up coming here because they're trying to escape persecution or abuse by the government because of their religious beliefs. And the Puritans, the irony is that the Puritans who were trying to escape, you know, religion discrimination in England, they themselves discriminated towards other groups of people, and it was very known in New England, in the Puritan settlements, that they didn't tolerate anyone else who was not of the Puritan religion or the. But for the most part, most people came here for these reasons: wealth and resources. Some wanted to get rich. Some wanted to companies wanted to find resources to send back to England to make the stuff in the factories. They were running out of trees. They were running out of resources. So the wealth and resources were very important for these English companies and all these and people who wanted to make themselves rich. Also, it was a new beginning for people. in who were coming from Europe. They were coming here because there was no land available. If they stayed in England or they stayed in whatever country in Europe, they were going to remain poor. If they were poor, their chances are that they would remain poor and their kids would remain poor. So coming to this place, which was a risk because of the journey, provided a great opportunity for them to be able to start a new life in a way where they were able to have an opportunity, a new beginning in a sense, to make themselves rich, have a much better life than they would have if they stay over there. Also, a lot of people came here because they wanted to get out of debt. So they came as indentured servants and worked for a few years until they were able to pay off their debt and be able to be free. Other times, some people just came to escape and have an opportunity to get away from what they owed over there. And finally, political persecution. Some people wanted to have more rights, wanted to have a little more freedom and not criticize the government. So they came here to escape political persecution. And as I mentioned, they also came to escape religious persecution. So looking here, the colonies, as you see them here, were divided into several regions. You had the New England colonies in purple, and green, the middle colonies, and then you had the southern colonies. And they were all distinct because each colony was unique in its characteristics. They were grouped together based on location, you know, reasons why they were founded and what type of industries they had. So the New England colonies will be Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. The middle colonies will be Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And finally, the southern colonies will be Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So you have these three geographical regions. And if you notice again, in prior to 1770s, 1750, these were the English colonies. And eventually they'll expand. And we'll talk more about that as we move on in the unit. But to begin with the New England colonies, most of the people there were from England. They tended to be the most homogeneous group, I'm sorry, because they were mostly all from England. They all had the same religion and came from the same region. The economy in New England was difficult because the soil was horrible. It was a cold climate and they had a short growing season. So agriculture was not ideal. Only for them to grow enough food to feed their families, but they began to focus more on manufacturing and trading goods, trading goods, building ships. They became known for shipbuilding. They became known for forestry, cutting down trees, sending them back to England. So they were focusing on that. And the climate tended to be colder than the other regions because of its northern location. It was very similar to what you see here in Chicago, where you have a winter, fall, spring, and summer, 4 seasons. And the geography is mostly hilly and rocky soil. And again, a lot of fish, whale hunting, trees, and furs. And the religion was mostly the Puritan religions. There was no such thing as religious freedom in New England. The Puritans were not tolerant of other groups, other religious groups coming in and exposing their views to others in this area. So for them, religion was only to be them and no one else. So now we move on to the middle colonies, which are Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. And these were a little more different. There was a real big contrast between them. And they were, a city like Philadelphia became known as probably the most cosmopolitan city in the colonies because there were so many different groups of people, so many immigrants, so many different points of views that were in the city. And this area tended to be the most ethnically and religiously diverse of all the colonies because you had a huge Polish, English, Dutch, French, and German influence in these cities. Because these cities, for example, New York City was known as New Amsterdam and was part of the Dutch. Eventually, the Dutch sold New York and New Amsterdam to the English, and they renamed it as New York City. But you had a lot of immigrants coming during this period. The climate in this area is relatively hot. They do get these really warm summers and humid summers. And out in the East Coast, they tend to be very muggy summers and all that. They do get cold, but their winter is not winter like you see here in Chicago. You tend to have the Gulf Current goes all the way up the eastern seaboard and provides kind of like that moderating temperature. So, temperatures in the winter they do get cold, but they also tend to be very pleasant. 40 degrees and not as cold as it gets here with below zero. The geography, the hills and the flatlands with good soil, and iron ore and good soil. But again, as I mentioned, there was a lot of different diversity, and this what made this area very appealing for many people. You had a mixture of religions, including Quakers, led by William Penn. William Penn was a person who came from England, and he created the Quake, and he established his colony in what would become known as Pennsylvania, named after him. And the Quakers were this peace-loving group of people who were tolerant of others. And you had Catholics, Lutherans, Jews, and other groups that came into this area. So this tended to be the more ethnically diverse area in the colonies. And then finally, we make our way down to the southern colonies, which were Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. They were diverse and consisted of many European nationalities. The climate was the warmest of the three regions and boasted the longest growing season. This area was mostly focused on agriculture because they had good land, but also because they had a long growing season. At first, it becomes tobacco. Tobacco becomes their big cash crop for Virginia. And then, unfortunately, you have the beginning of slavery in these areas as they realize that slaves can create a huge profit for them, and eventually becomes the big cash crop later on. The geography here, they had a broad coastal plain that was hilly and covered with forests, and the natural resources were rich farmlands, forests, and fish. The religion did not have any large influence on the daily life of southern colonists. The southern colonists had a mixture of religion, including Baptists and Anglicans, and this is a little quick preview of these regions of the third colonies. But one thing you should know as you finish this lesson is that 13 colonies were very influential, were very diverse, and this differences is good in some way, but also will become a major source of conflict as we move on later into the history of the United States as well. Christian religion that they believe.